Okay, well, let me get going with the introductions, and I'm sure people will join us as we go. So this is Sue McKenna. I suppose I should quickly turn on my camera. I sort of make the joke that I turn on my camera to prove that it's really a human being here, but in the day and age of deep fakes, seeing is no longer believing. So just because you can see my face doesn't mean I'm real. But please take my word for it. I am real. It is Sue McKenna here, and I, along with Stephanie Burton, who I see is in the room, the two of us head up the EQPE, Enhancing Quality of Postgraduate Education, which is an informal grouping of people across every university and private higher education institution in South Africa who are interested in postgraduate education. And we try just to put together spaces for us to think through various issues. And today we're really delighted that we've got Ahmed Essop with us. And he's going to be talking through a really big study that he did, which was published by the CHE. He did it under the Saatchi chair at UJ, where he is, in fact, at Mazrui Center, he is a research associate. Other than that, he's a very mysterious person. If you try and search him online, you're going to find very little about him, but everyone knows his name from these various reports that he's produced over the years and from all his other work in higher education. But yeah, that's one of the things I do find that quite interesting about you, Ahmed, that you've managed in this day and age of social media to be simultaneously quite well known and yet pretty elusive. I couldn't find anything tantalizing in your past to share with people.
I'm not
So
on social media, so
yeah, you see, you live a life off social media. This is a rare thing in this day and age, and I have to say, I'm increasingly thinking it's a very wise thing indeed. So thank you so much for joining us today and for being willing to take us through this report. As you say, it was published by the CHE as Higher Education Monitor number 17, but it actually was produced some years ago, and so it takes us through statistics up to 2020. Be quite interesting, I think, to now update it in more recent HEMIS data, but nonetheless, it's not that long ago, and it certainly, I thought, provided all sorts of very important insights that those of us who are concerned about postgraduate education should try and wrap our heads around. So I'm going to hand over to you, and thanks again for offering to share your thoughts with us.
well, thanks, Sue. I'll briefly turn on my camera so you can see who I am. As I indicated earlier, and apologies to people who previously participated, I know Stephanie was a respondent together with Ahmed Bawa when the findings were first presented in early 2023. This study was completed then. The CHE works in mysterious ways. It's taken 2 years for it to be published. It is available both online and in hard copy. So the presentation is really going to focus on the report, which was commissioned. Sheila, you can move to the next slide, which was commissioned by the Council on Higher Education in response to a request from the then Minister of Higher Education and Training, Blade Nzimande, regarding concerns that postgraduate enrollments were skewed in favor of international students and that South African students, particularly at the doctoral level, were being discriminated against. And in addressing the particular issue raised by the minister, we'd also looked more broadly as an opportunity to assess the targets that were set in the National Development Plan for postgraduate education. I'm sure many of you, all of you, would be familiar with the NDP 2030 targets, which was that postgraduate enrollments should constitute 25% of total university enrollments, that we should be producing at least 5,000 doctoral graduates annually, and that academic staff qualifications should reach about 75% of academic staff in higher education. So that's the context within which the report was done. And the report has two sections. One is a quantitative section with a lot of statistical data and analysis based on HEMIS data. And the second part is a qualitative section, which is based on a set of unstructured interviews with institutional managers, postgraduate directors, as well as some DVCs, and more importantly, with a small group, and I'll speak about that later, of doctoral graduates and postdocs. And this afternoon, hopefully I can do all of this in about half an hour, so there's more time for discussion. I'm going to focus on both. In terms of the report, as Sue mentioned, it was done in 2022, and the timelines are 2005 to 2022 in terms of the HEMOS data. In 2005, because that was the year in which institutions were merged, incorporated, and so forth. And so the new institutional structure landscape took place. And 2020, because as you know, there's a 2-year time lag in HEMOS data and in terms of verified HEMOS data. And 2022, that was the only available data at that stage. I don't expect there may be, I haven't really looked carefully at the more recent, there is 2022 data available. I don't expect that there'll be significant changes, but there would be changes along the margins in that report. Next, Sheila. Okay, so to look at the key trends, there's a lot of statistical data in the report. I'm not going to look at all of that. I'm going to highlight some of what I think are the key trends, which can serve as a basis for the discussion. The first point to make is that enrollments in higher education in this period have increased by roughly 54%. The undergraduate enrollments increased by 54%, and postgraduate enrollments increased by 53%. But what is significant is that as a proportion of total enrollment in higher education, there hasn't been significant change. The system remains primarily, stubbornly, an undergraduate system. 86% of enrollments were in undergraduate programs and 14% in postgraduate programs. There's been a minor change. The most recent data, 2022 data, suggests that undergraduate enrollments have gone down by 1% and postgraduate enrollments have increased to 15%. But that's not a significant change. And in part, it's not surprising that we are largely an undergraduate system given issues of access, past inequalities, access to higher education, and so forth. So the NDP target, which was the NDP target is the total enrollments in 2030 should be just over 1.6 million students, of which 25% should be in postgraduate programs. In order for that to be met, postgraduate enrollments would have to increase, this is between 2020 and 2030, in a 10-year period, by 168%. That is 3 times more than the increase from 2005 to 2020, which quite frankly is unrealistic, both in terms of the resources, the capacity of the system, particularly at the doctoral level, in terms of supervision and so forth. It would also require, reducing undergraduate enrollments, which, as you can imagine, would lead to a revolution in the country. So it's totally unrealistic. How they arrived at the target, in general, how they arrived at the targets in the NDP are mysterious. My own sense is they're largely thumbsucks based on nice to haves, but we can come back to that in the discussion. In terms of the different qualification levels, there's 3 that the report looks at. It doesn't distinguish between postgraduate diplomas and honors enrollments because of the way in which the data is captured in HEMOS, and masters and doctoral enrollments. And masters enrollments is largely, if I remember correctly, it shows my age. I'm retired and sort of spend my time fluffing around, UJ. I don't think we included research masters. It was mainly taught masters programs that we included at the time. So in terms of the total increases, postgraduate diplomas, honors have increased in that period by 50%. And in terms of masters increased by 36%. And the most significant increase was at the doctoral level, where doctoral enrollments increased by 150%. And that changed the proportions of total postgraduate enrollments. PG Dip honors went down slightly from 47 to 45% as a proportion of postgraduate enrollments. Masters was a little higher, 45 to 40, but the most significant change was at the doctoral level from 10 to 16%. And I'm going to focus more on the doctoral program because that was seemed to be the major concern of the minister at the time. Next one, Sheila. Sorry, I'm not technologically, apart from the fact that I'm not on social media, I wasn't sure I'd manage to share and do it at the same time. Well, I shouldn't be apologizing for that anyway. Race, if you take race, the overall increase of black students is 82%, black South African students, and I use black as African, colored, and Indian. If we include students from the rest of Africa, the increase in postgraduate enrollments was some 88%. The increases in the different qualification levels outlined 73% in PG Honors, 78% in Masters, and the most significant increase is at the doctoral level, where Black South African enrollments increased by 230%. And if we include the rest of Africa, it's 289%. So a very significant change in growth among Black students, which is what seemed to be the concern that was being raised by the minister, and which seems to be an issue that the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee keeps harping on. There's been a proportionate decrease in white students. I'm not going to go through. You can see the only increase in white students was at a doctoral level, where white South African students increased by 2%. And if you include students from the rest of the world, not from the rest of Africa, on the assumption that the rest of the world were white students, which is a big assumption to make, the increase was 4%. So as an overall proportion of total enrollments in postgraduate, Black South Africans constitute 80% of all enrollments at the postgraduate level, and whites 20%. And the different qualification levels, in all the different qualification levels, there are more black students than there are white students. So there's been a significant change in the racial demographics of the postgraduate enrollments. In terms of gender, females increased by 68% and males by 36%, which again is not surprising given that there are more females, more women at the undergraduate level. I think it's 58 or 59% at the undergraduate level over a period of time, which is now also reflecting at the postgraduate level. And in particular, if you look at the doctoral level, it's 190% increase, while in the case of males, it's 122%. What's not clear is the drop in male master's enrollments, which only grew by 12%. But as an overall proportion, there are more females in postgraduate programs, close to the same proportion as in undergraduate programs, 57%. And the only qualification level in which females are just less than men is at the doctoral level, where it's 48%. But if you look at the increase in female enrollments at the master's level, in 2005, I don't have the figure in the slide, but in 2005, the only area in which females were in the majority was in the PG Dip honors level. But since then, they've taken over at the master's level. And then the way in which it's growing, I would imagine by now, if it's not already happened, very soon there'll be parity, or if not more females at the doctoral level than there are males. Okay, next. I'm still going to go through all of this and we can take it up in the discussion later on. Sheila, next, thanks. Okay, this is the slide that speaks to the issue raised by the minister regarding the skewed enrollments in favor of international students, particularly at the doctoral level. So the overall increase in postgraduate enrollments, black and white for South Africa, in this period was 48%, and the major increase was at the doctoral level of 106%. But as you can see, international enrollments increased close to double, by 92%. And particularly, there was a significant substantive increase in postgraduate enrollments from the rest of Africa, and especially at the doctoral level, where it increased by 414%, which is substantive. As a result of that increase, although the proportion of South African students went down slightly across the different qualification levels, from 88% to 85%, and international students increased similarly by 3% to 15%, at the master's and PG DIP honors level, South African proportion of totals remained fairly stable at 93 and 86%. And I think that's important, and we can pick it up later on, because it suggests that from a professional, from a career, and from a labor market point of view, honors, PGDIP honors and master's programs have greater value in the labor market than do doctoral programs. And it's something I think we should come back to later on. But as a result of that massive increase in students from the rest of Africa of 414%, the proportion of South African students enrolled in doctoral programs went down from 77% to 63%. But that in itself doesn't indicate that students are being discriminated against. So let me just step back. The reason for the fairly massive increase from the rest of Africa and is that in 2005, the new funding formula came on stream, which gave a very high weighting for research masters and doctoral enrollments and graduates. And that was deliberately done because at the time, there was a concern that we were not producing enough graduates at the research masters and doctoral level, including in terms of research outputs, which, as you know, in the case of research outputs, is now left has resulted in a perverse incentive where institutions run after research outputs and forget about teaching and the quality of the outputs. But that's a separate matter. So in 2005, the incentive to institutions was to increase their doctoral enrollments from a subsidy point of view. There was a financial incentive. It's been argued that aside from the financial incentive, that there was also increased capacity, supervisory capacity to increase doctoral enrollments. I haven't seen any hard evidence to support that. There may or may not have been. It's certainly the case, I suspect now, that people are being that there are many more students than they can cope with in terms of supervision. South African students, so the increased enrollments that institutions required at the time was not being taken up by South African students, largely because of funding. And we'll come back to the funding issue. So the space that was created was taken up by students from the rest of Africa because South Africa was an attractive option. Attractive both in terms of costs. It was cheaper to come and do a PhD or other doctoral study in South Africa than to do it in the UK, USA, Europe, Australia. Secondly, South African institutions, particularly the research-intensive institutions, had a good and growing reputation in the rest of Africa. And in fact, the majority of students from the rest of Africa who came to do doctoral programs went to the 4 or 5 research-intensive institutions at the time. So in a sense, the fact that the proportion of South African students has gone down is because there was no take-up, no demand or no supply, given what the universities wanted to do because of funding reasons. From the institutional point of view, students from the rest of Africa were attractive because they came and studied full-time instead of part-time, which the majority of South African students do. They came with funding, whether it was sponsored funding or self-funding. And as many of the postdoctoral directors pointed out, and in some cases deans, is that they had better foundational skills to pursue postgraduate study, or to pursue doctoral study rather. So there was it's not an incentive, but there was also an attraction for institutions to recruit students from the rest of Africa. But the key point is that there's no evidence to suggest that the concerns raised by the minister or the parliamentary committee regarding that enrollments were being skewed in favor, that South African students were being discriminated. There's no evidence to support that. It's also interesting, in the period from 2005 to 2015, doctoral enrollments increased by about 100%. Subsequently, between 2015 and 2020, there was a smaller increase of about 21%. And more currently, when I looked at the figures for 2020 to 2022, it's only increased by about 5%, which seems to suggest that institutional capacity may be at a maximum in terms of supervisory capacity and so on. My own view is that the increase after 2005 was largely driven by a funding incentive rather than increased institutional capacity. But that's an issue for discussion and debate subsequently. Thanks. Next, Sheila. In relation to field of study, if I want to, what I would like to highlight is that there's been a significant increase across the different qualification levels in science, engineering, and technology, a minor, across the different qualifications, a small decrease in the humanities, a fairly significant decrease in education, which is largely to do with the fact that the PG dip in education was taken away at some point, if I remember correctly. But the real concern is that as far as the overall proportion of doctoral students is concerned, is 49% are enrolled in SET, 12% in business and commerce, which is a significant increase from what it was in 2005, and a substantive decrease in the humanities, which I think is excluding education, which is a cause for concern, given the increasing important role that the humanities play in terms of addressing the global grand challenges, in terms of the need to address issues, social and cultural issues in relation to technology and so forth. And in part, the increase in, well, not in part, the main reason I think for the increase in SET is because of the bias in the NRF bursaries. So in 2021, at the honors level, 72%, master's level, 75%, and at the doctoral level, 81% of bursaries were allocated to SET. So it's no wonder, in a sense, that the SET enrollments have increased in the proportions that they have. In the case of education, it's remained fairly stable. I have a bugbear. I think we should just reduce and not have too many students doing PhDs in education. In 2020, there were 2,000 students enrolled in education at the doctoral level. Large majority, 99% of those students, in my estimation, were enrolled. There were school principals, head teachers, and so forth, who were enrolled in education not because either they were interested in contributing to knowledge or to pursuing academic careers, but either because there were promotion possibilities and a doctorate made a difference in the school system, in some cases because of individual interests and so forth. But the kinds of topics that people study leave a lot to be desired. So to give you one example, and I'm harping on this because I have a view that we should just cut doctoral enrollments in education. We recently, last year, in the center, had a student who was proposing to look at the impact of load shedding on two schools in Ekurhuleni in Gauteng. So I leave you to decide whether that's an appropriate topic for a PhD or not. Okay, next one. Thank you, Sheila. In terms of throughputs, the report looks at two cohorts, the 2010 cohort and the 2015 cohort. Across the different qualification levels, there was a general increase in the throughputs, both in regulation time and in 5 or 6 years after a 3-year qualification. At the doctoral level, there was an increase in regulation time, that is 3 years, from 18% to 40%, which is a fairly significant increase. And in N+3, which is after 6 years, is increased from 50 to 66%. I think that raises concerns, at least in my mind, about the quality, issues of quality at the doctoral level. I mean, a 22% increase in regulation time is a substantive increase. Now, unless there's evidence that it's because of interventions at the doctoral level in terms of supervisory support, mentoring, and so forth, it's hard to fathom how you could have such a big increase in this period. So I think that's something that the group EQPE may want to take up as part of a longer-term project. In terms of doctoral graduates, there was a massive increase, just under 200% in this period. So in 2020, the system graduated just over 3,500 doctoral students. It's got at an annual average of 8%. More recently, when I looked at the figures, it's gone down. It's about 4 or 5%. But at the rate, if it continues at this rate, by 2030, it's one of the targets in the NDP that will be met. We will produce not more than 5,000, but at least 5,000 doctoral graduates by 2030, largely because of the increase, I think, of the enrollments, particularly from the rest of Africa. So the major problem that in terms of the postgraduate enrollments, particularly at the doctoral level, is that we have low enrollment and progression rates. As you know, the majority of doctoral students study part-time. The average age of graduation is 41 or 42, and that speaks to the nature of the pipeline. So the figures I've provided in the report look at the period 2014 to 2021. The figures are cumulative figures and can be broken down into different years. But if you take honours, after 7 years, 78% of honours students who graduated, and 50% of those enrolled for masters. After 6 years in masters enrollments, 12% graduated and 9% enrolled for doctorates. And after 5 years, only 1% of that cohort graduated with a doctorate. So the major stumbling block that we face is that we're not attracting students in a normal, traditional, coming into undergraduate, going on to do honors and masters, and immediately after that progress into a doctorate. Only 16% of doctoral graduates were under 30, which means they completed their studies uninterrupted full-time. And as you know, the NRF has, I think, changed its policy. It's now not going to fund. It expects all doctoral graduates to have completed their study by the age 35 or 36. I forget the detail. But that is a significant problem that the system faces, and that needs to be addressed, is to attract people at the undergraduate level and who go through uninterrupted and complete their studies by age 30 or so. Next, Shiloh. This is not directly pertinent, and it's not in the report itself, but I thought in the context of the NDP target of a 75% of staff with doctorates by 2030, it'd be useful to have a look. As you can see, there has been an increase from 30% to 52% in 2022. It's not clear to me, again, on what basis the NDP arrived at the 75% target. There seems to be an assumption that academic staff with doctorates would result in improved performance, student performance and outcomes. It would provide more supervisory capacity, research productivity, and so forth. It's arguable in terms of better student performance and outcomes, and certainly at the undergraduate level, whether academics require a doctorate or whether a greater focus or the scholarship of teaching and learning would result in better student performance. But that's something we can take up if there's an interest in that area. But at the time I looked at, I haven't got the latest figures. It was interesting to see that in the UK higher educational system, only 66% of the permanent staff had doctorates. Similarly, in Australia, combination of permanent and academic temporary staff or doctorates was 68%. So that in a sense, oh, the next one, sorry, Shilo. So the final sort of statistical data slide is in relation to funding. Funding is a major issue in terms of the quantum of funding that's available. So in 2022, of all the postgraduate applicants across the different honors, masters, and doctoral level that applied and were eligible for admission, only 36% of postgraduate students were funded by the NRF. And there was a shortfall roughly of 1.3 billion rand. And of the majority of the students who were not funded were South African, 78%, 72% were Black, and 61% were female. And there was reduced funding in 2022 from 2021 of about 6%, and which largely had to do with the increase in the value of the bursaries that were being granted. So the quantum of funding that is available, in large part, in my view, and I'm sure when I spoke to people, funding was identified as a major problem in the system. The NRF increased, and I think the current doctoral, and I haven't seen the figure, is probably just under 180,000. Why there was a substantive increase at the honors level and the master's level and a lower increase at the doctoral level, quite frankly, I have no clue. But it is interesting currently, if you enter into the public service as an assistant director with a 3-year diploma or degree, the starting salary is in the region of 468,000. So the opportunity cost of doing a doctorate is large in terms of, and particularly given that employment possibilities post a doctorate are limited in the higher education sector and certainly not both in the public and private sector. So it does again raise questions of, if we want to increase and target more doctoral students, what are we doing about funding, both the quantum of funding and the funding that's given to individual students. As I understand it, in determining the figures, the NRF used what an individual student required as a full cost of study, rather than what, if you were an adult in your mid-20s, mid to late 20s, possibly with a family and so on, what may be required. So there are sort of broader issues that need to be looked at in terms of both the quantum of funding and whether the individual bursary is sufficient as an attraction, particularly for first-generation students. That brings to, in a sense, close to the data issues that are covered in the report. There's a whole lot of other data there, as I said, which you can follow in your leisure. If you've read the report, we can pick up in the discussion. If I can move to the next slide, Shiloh. So as part of the report, I interviewed, as I said, aside from institutional managers, a small group of postgraduate or of doctoral graduates. They're representative in terms of being from urban, rural backgrounds, first generation, and students whose parents had studied at university, students who were in both public and private schools, and in 1 or 2 cases, students from outside the country. And for me, in a sense, that part, although it's not representative, and certainly not representative in a disciplinary sense, is that they largely were all students who came from were studying in higher education, came from different disciplines in the humanities. Fortunately, none of them came straight from a B.Ed or a M.Ed into PhD study. So there were no students from the science faculty, from commerce, and so forth. So in that sense, it's not representative. But it does seem to me, and I'll go through some of the key challenges, that we need to do more qualitative studies, narrative biographies, which explain and give us a better sense of the story behind the figures. So if one of the things when I spoke to all the institutional managers about why Black South Africans or first generation Black South Africans don't pursue postgraduate or doctoral study, the standard response, and it was something that I came into the study myself, was that there's pressure from the family to get a job, to support the extended family, the issues of the black tax, and so on. And what's really surprising is that none of the 12 students that I spoke to were under any pressure not to pursue postgraduate study. It's not to suggest that they weren't providing support to their siblings or other members of the family while they were studying, but there was no pressure whatsoever, and maybe they're not representative, not to continue studying after they completed their undergraduate study. The family and the communities from which they came could not understand why they were continuing, what the point of doing postgraduate study was, but there was no pressure, at least in the group that I interviewed, that they should leave and get a job and get an income which would support the rest of the family. So by doing this sort of qualitative study, it does challenge some of the assumptions that we have about what people do and what people don't do. The second and most striking feature of what came out of the interviews with the graduate students was, by and large, well, not by and large, that in all the cases, except for 2 students, who became academics, what I called accidental academics, or which one of the students called accidental academics. They were accidental both in terms of their choice of discipline, field of study, as well as the journey that they undertook from undergraduate to postgraduate study. If you take the field of study, choice of field of study, many of them either chose their discipline because there was somebody, they had a friend who was studying A, B, or C, and therefore they went into that. In some cases, there were siblings. In worst case, the sibling had textbooks, so it would be easier not to have to spend money on buying textbooks if you did the same course as the sibling. Or they were influenced by people in the media who came from communities, surrounding communities. Tito Mboweni is a case in point, Wiseman and Kushlu, Sizwe and Nakaza, all of whom were major players in the world of finance. And so a lot of them wanted to do commerce or accounting at university. By and large, when they admitted to university, if they didn't get their first choice, they took whatever they could get into. So there was very little, in a sense, career guidance. Whatever career guidance they got was linked to what people in the community had done, those who had done professional careers, nursing, social work, and teaching by and large. And they got very little career guidance at the point of entry or throughout their undergraduate study at university. So career guidance seems to be a major issue that needs to be tackled in general across the board. The second big issue that was raised by the students is that they were not exposed in the undergraduate programs to research or to developing research skills. So they had no understanding of what it meant to pursue an academic career. And there were limited role models. And in cases where there were role models, they had identified and worked with individual students. In some cases, the role models were emerging young black scholars in particular departments. As one of them said, you go as far as you see. Where departments were more open with senior undergraduates, inviting them to seminars and more informal socials, etc., they begin to get a better understanding of what an academic life in the academic environment was about. So intentionality is critical, it seems to me, if we want to attract people into postgraduate, particularly doctoral programs. So the 2 students who were the recipients of the Mellon Mays scholarship, and Mellon Mays, for those of you who, I'm not sure if it still exists, but was a program where at the end of the second year, a group of talented students were identified and then given parallel support in terms of developing research projects, attending seminars, in some cases being sent overseas to attend conferences to present their work, and so forth. And as the 2 students who went through Mellon Mays and very clearly, intentionally were influenced to continue into doctoral study, indicated that it exposed them to what an academic career involved, what it meant to be an academic, and the kinds of opportunities that may exist. A colleague of mine in the center who comes from Ethiopia indicated that in Ethiopia, They identify 5% of the most talented undergraduates and then provide them with support and mentorship from undergraduate to doctoral study. Now, as you know, in staffing South African universities framework, a component of it was to nurture emerging scholars. But in practice, it's not been done at undergraduate level. It has been done at the master's level. But even then, while support was provided in terms of mentoring and so forth, there was no guarantee of funding to continue with doctoral study. So it does seem to me it does raise questions about, do we need all the doctoral students that we're producing? If not, how do we target and focus on those students who we want to identify and we can take through from undergraduate with the appropriate support and funding through doctoral study? As far as, sorry, I'm taking a little longer than I should. As far as the doctoral experience is concerned, it was mixed, both positive and negative. As one student indicated, there were horror stories in terms of supervision, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. Supervisors who didn't comment on their work, in one case for up to a year, or often asked their colleagues, other postgraduates, to read and comment on the work and so forth. The issues of the power relationship. And what many of them raised was the need to rethink the one-on-one model, whether we needed for want of a better cohort model. As one said, education is a social process. You learn in the process of engaging with critique, engaging with different theoretical and methodological approaches, and so forth. And whether in the South African context, a cohort model may be more appropriate. It's not to suggest that a cohort model is the answer to all of the problems. I think, as Sue and her colleagues have pointed out, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and it may well be, given the resource constraints, that it will be a lot more difficult to develop a cohort model. But the point is, we haven't really had a debate about whether the current models are appropriate and whether we should be thinking of a cohort model. All the focus in the SF study and in the CHE study on the doctorate was really about how to make, aside from the improve the relationship between supervisors and the graduate student and the frameworks and agreements that need to be set in place, was really about efficiency. How do we ensure that students complete in 3 or 4 years so that we can get more people into the system and out of the system? So I think there needs to be a broader debate about the models that we use for postgraduate study. And the final point is about funding, that funding is not sufficient, both the quantum of funding, but whether 180,000 or whatever currently doctoral students are being provided is sufficient to meet their needs as adults. As many of them said, we're not looking for large salaries, but we would like to be treated as adults, to recognize that we may have families, we may have children, we may need to buy a car and so forth, or rent a house, whatever the case may be. And as I indicated earlier, it's absolutely not clear on what basis the NRF had arrived at the figures that it has. And a similar thing goes with the postdoc experience. I'm not going to go into that. On average, postdocs earn about 250,000 per annum. They're effectively there so that institutions can generate a subsidy through increased outputs. But maybe I should stop there in terms of time. Thanks, Sue.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Ahmed. Lots to think about. I've got 101 questions myself, but I'm not going to take advantage of my position. Instead, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Stephanie. Stephanie and I co-host the EQPE project. And Stephanie, I wonder if you can manage the Q&A. Let's hope we have some really good discussion.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Sue. And thank you so much, Ahmed. It's very interesting to hear the conclusions that your original work provided and to see how things kind of continued and not actually changed a great deal in that time. But thank you. So, colleagues, we have an opportunity now for some questions and comments. So please do feel free to either, if you can find your electronic hand, put it up. And otherwise, of course, you can add questions to the chat box if you prefer. So I will attempt to to keep an eye on both, just to make sure I see if anybody does put their hands up. But perhaps I can start. As Sue said, there's so much to think about in all of this. You know, the question that, no, the point that comes up all the time whenever we have these meetings or various colloquia and so on, the first thing that people come up with is the funding issue. You know, and the reason why people are not studying or are not carrying on or not completing their degrees, their higher degrees, is often because of financial issues. And related to that, and in my mind, directly related to that in some cases, is the fact that the majority of our students work part-time and study part-time. And we kind of make that difficult for them. And so I wondered, Ahmed, if you have a view on the value of working part-time and studying for longer, and whether we should be kind of advocating for that model rather than a full-time get the studying done and then get out into work.
Well, it seems to me, and one of the students who was enrolled for a doctoral program, was studying part-time. But he was studying, or his employment was in an area that was linked to his study. So he was doing something on youth employment in the provincial government department, and he was doing his PhD in a similar area. So for him, the transition or managing his work and study was in a sense, what's the word? There was no pressure to focus on one or the other. It was part of his work. So in a sense, it does seem to me that if government was more imaginative, it would enroll graduate students in assistant director, deputy director positions, and get them to do the kind of research that departments do, which they often ask consultants like me to do. You know, there's no reason why they can't do that. Our departments, I mean, I can speak for education based on my past experience, do very little research and background development. So if you were to employ students and link it to a period of study and what they were studying, then the problem, in a sense, is not as acute as when you're trying to study and work in an environment where study is not where your study is not recognized for the value that it may have. So I think we need to rethink the qualifications that we ask of people in the public sector, and whether we can create pathways where they can do doctoral study while they are working in cognizant areas or linked to their work. That seems to me one way of addressing the problem.
Yeah. A couple of comments in the chat, one of them from Sue, and that perhaps you'd like to comment on the issue of quality. Well, of course, for me, quality has many definitions, but the issue of quality in terms of a decrease in the time to completion and how we ascertain the cost of that pressure on the quality of the research that is done and the qualification that is obtained.
Look, I mean, firstly, I didn't mention, but all the students that I spoke to said 3 years is not sufficient. They thought 4 or 5 years, given all the other concerns about what happens in your life and so forth, was more appropriate to do. I think the pressure, and my sense, the reason I'm raising the quality issue, I think there's a pressure at an institutional level to get people through in 3 years. For financial reasons. You know, the subsidy comes in, the longer they spend, the more bums on seats, you're losing out. So I think there's increasing. I mean, I think people on the platform here would be in better place. But my sense, including at the undergraduate level, is there clearly significant improvements in throughput rates. I have questions about what that means for quality, or whether that's or improvement is because of real interventions that are taking place, which is resulting in enhancing the quality of the graduate. Certainly what I've seen, at least at the postdoc level, and some of what I've read and papers that I've commented on, in the center that I'm based, raise a whole lot of questions for me about the quality of their prior doctoral program. But I
Yeah,
think it's a more
absolutely.
general question.
I would like to come back to that in a moment, but let me not ignore Dirk Wester's comment, which is in the chat also, where he says the thing that interests him is whether we know how many of our doctoral graduates benefit from completing their degree by promotion or by job opportunity, and do we track this in any way? So do we have a way of tracking how our graduates, our doctoral graduates continue, and how their doctoral degree benefits them?
Well, it's possible to do in theory, it doesn't happen in practice. So because the HEMIS system collects data by ID, it's possible to track over a period of time. The HSRC in the past used to do a survey tracking what happened to students. I don't think that no longer happens. So in theory, it's possible. In practice, it's not happening. There was a survey done of postgraduates by Johan Mouton and company a few years ago at CRIS, and that indicated that the large majority of postdocs were in the system, in some cases for up to 8 or 9 years, because there were no employment opportunities. It's quite clear that in the private sector, a doctorate is not important. Certainly at a senior level, you need an MBA. The universities are not don't have job opportunities. 60% of the staff are temporary. It's not enough funding to employ doctoral graduates. The research funding, although the target for research funding in general was meant to be just over 1% of GDP, I forget. We've never reached that. In fact, it's been going down. And given the current climate with the sort of stopping of funding, research funding from the US and so forth, increasingly, I suspect we're producing more doctoral students than the system can, or the society can employ. And that does raise the question of what is the value of a doctorate? Why do a doctorate? And as you saw, the most stable part of the postgraduate system was master's and honors level, because that's important from a career and professional point of view. And so the market is, or the student market is saying, we need masters and honors, less so doctorates. So we need to think about whether we want to produce these millions of doctorates. The NDP target was set based on the assumption, and they looked at a large number of developed countries, economic growth and innovation. But it's not got to do with per se having a doctorate. It's got to do with whether we're investing in innovation, whether we're investing in research and new ways of doing things. If we're not doing that, having a doctorate is meaningless, I think.
Ahmed, can I pose a question, or at least, hear what you think about the issue that you alluded to a moment ago, and that is the preparation for doing higher degrees. We have had various discussions around the idea that, or with the opinion that our students come into postgraduate studies underprepared for what we're expecting of them, and that particularly at the doctoral level. And that is partly related to the expectation that our students all have a master's degree, and therefore the master's degree should be in some way a preparation for the doctoral study. I have recently done a study, a different project entirely, but on the effectiveness of converting registration for a master's directly to a doctoral registration without actually completing the master's qualification, which is controversial and actually a minority, but it really did show me the effect or the impact of what master's preparation needs to do and what one would expect of a doctoral student going into a doctoral study. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, look, I think it actually goes beyond the master's. It's at the undergraduate level, whether our students are adequately prepared when they come out. Now, I'm less, well, let me give you, really, it shows my age. I studied in the UK in the 1970s, and at the time it was a very elitist system. You could go to university and not spend all your time in the pub, and you still got a piece of paper at the end of it that said you spent 3 years doing something at the university. And when I came back to South Africa at the time, I did some teaching at Wits in the sociology department. And I was completely astounded because, and it was a small group of 50 students or so, because the system hadn't grown that much. Primarily 95% were white students. I had assumed that white education was school education at any rate, was of a high quality. And that was what we had worked on or the common understanding. I was completely shocked that they weren't able to do independent study. They weren't able to, they expected me to provide them with all the information in the lecture. They regurgitated whatever the lecture had, often incorrectly, and so forth. So I think there's a major problem with what we expect between school and university. So to give you an example, when I did my A-levels, when I went to university, the gap wasn't great. What I was doing at A-level at the time had prepared me for university study. And what I was teaching in the first year in sociology or second year in sociology was not very different from what I had gone through as an undergraduate in the UK. But our students didn't have the benefit of an in-between between leaving school and coming into university. Now, as you know, the CHE, at least when I was heading the CHE, we did a study looking at the undergraduate structure of the undergraduate degree, and we proposed, or the task team that was set up proposed that we rethink the undergraduate program to a 4-year program to address the particular concerns, gaps between school, the articulation gap between. So I think it happens at all levels of our system. So historically, again, if you take people who did honors in the past, honors was a very small, restricted group of students who did honors. When they went and did a taught masters in the UK, they were over-prepared for that. In fact, they were bored with the taught masters because honors was so intensive. So I think we've got a degree structure that doesn't make sense. And we've not really seriously looked at what needs to be done. So I think there's a bigger problem. I'm not sure about, I think when people do a 3-year research masters, that doesn't make sense to me. That would make sense if you enrolled for a research master's to be able to convert to a PhD. I'm not sure you can directly convert from a 1-year taught master's program into a PhD.
Yeah,
I don't know if that addresses.
No, I do. I really do. I actually agree with you entirely. I'd like to just give Liesel Frick an opportunity. Liesel, would you like to actually frame your question? Because you've written lots and lots in the chat, which I don't really want to read out. But Liesel, please go ahead and question, and let's have the discussion that you're framing there.
So there are about 3 different points. I'll summarize them very quickly for you. The first is what stands out for me is that I think we need to make a very clear distinction, which many universities are currently not doing, between full-time and part-time enrollments at all levels, as well as between residential and non-residential enrollments, because these are all variables that have a direct influence on time to completion. And I think if we have a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to time to completion, we are setting people up for failure, both academics and the students, which is not fair and just in a society where fairness and justice is actually at the forefront of what we think about and do. Prof. Essop, if your views on that would be welcome. The second instance, I think, is around whether or not academics should have PhDs. Now, while I agree with you that we are probably producing too many, and we also need to be very critical about what they are working on and why they are doing PhDs, I completely agree with your point on that, and particularly in education. And I think that's where the distinction between PhDs by research and professional doctorates, that split may be useful, although we generally don't have a capacity to run parallel programs in the country. I do think for the academic stream, if we follow the logic of integrated scholarship and what a scholar means, I still am a strong believer that academics should actually have PhDs, because I do think it can potentially make them better teachers in the classroom because of their expertise that they can bring into the classroom. So how do we help people and institutions to value that above and beyond a qualification and a title? Because that's secondary for me. It's about what you've learned and how you've developed as a person and what you bring as a whole person into your workspace. And that leads to the third and final comment around industry involvement. Previous research has shown, and Johan and I have had discussions about this, and Johan has some disagreements with it based on their tracer study, but some research has shown around listed companies in South Africa that they actually actively screen out doctorates, people with doctorates, because they're seen as overqualified and too expensive to employ. However, I think part of the problem is we need to take a step back and not see those people as sort of only researchers, but they're not just highly qualified, they're actually highly developed, skilled potential workforce, because they learn way more through doing a PhD than just the narrow research topic that they become experts on. And I don't think we help doctoral graduates to really articulate that well as institutions. And I think, to me, the main question lies there: how do we help students to articulate what they've learned and who they've become above and beyond their narrow research topic? So thank you. I'll stop there.
Look, I'm sure there are people who have views to be able to address some of these issues. Look, my general view about scholarship, I think there's something called the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I think if you don't necessarily, particularly at the junior levels of an undergraduate degree, you don't necessarily require a PhD to be able to teach in interesting and exciting ways. What you require is to be familiar with the literature, whatever the literature is in the discipline that you're teaching, and to be able to bring that alive in the classroom. I think at the senior levels, so maybe third year honors, certainly, the research that people do as part of their doctoral studies and the research that they continue afterwards is brought to bear in the programs and courses they teach. So I'm not sure, I know it's an unpopular view, that I don't think, given the nature of the system, given the nature of the challenges that we face, I would much rather have a large group of well-qualified master's students who are scholars in terms of their understanding of the discipline and are able to teach and address the particular needs of undergraduate students that we have. You know, if you take Harvard, I forget if it's still the case, but Harvard has a teaching track. You don't need a PhD in order to, there are limits to what you can do in terms of progression. You can't become a full professor and so on, but you accept that there's a teaching track and there are limits to what you can do. Similarly, you can do research in teaching and learning. A lot of our institutions don't think research in teaching and learning is important. It's not real research. It's not recognized and supported in faculties and so forth. So I have a sort of slightly different view about whether we need every academic to have a PhD. In terms of the industry, well, I mean, I know that the study that Chris did is where, you know, HR just weeds out what PhD graduates because they're not seen. I'm not sure whether the PhD necessarily gives you the broader skills that you may require to engage in society or in the workplace, because it's very narrowly focused. And you come out of the PhD, you may be an expert in the sociology of whatever or the history of whatever, but whether it gives you the skills, it probably does, but it's not necessarily a direct relationship between the skills you come out with. And one of the problems, even at the academic level, I think, and I think there's something we can learn from the American system, that it's a much broader base. American students, PhD students, from an academic point of view, have to do a whole range of coursework.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're leaving, they even if they move into the academic world, they not narrowly focus on their particular expertise in terms of their dissertation. So I suspect there needs to be a broader engagement with industry about what the role of the PhD is. And there are people with PhDs in things like physics and so forth that go and work in the financial services area because of the particular skills that they have. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a broader debate that we need to have.
Thank you. Yeah. Lisa, I'll give you one chance. And Alan, I do see your hand. Lisa?
I'll make it very quick just to respond. I think because there is something like the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and I do know that it's not always valued, but that is precisely why I'm not just talking about PhDs in your particular discipline. A PhD can be around the teaching and learning within your discipline. And we have multiple examples of that, which I think are equally valid. And then secondly, in terms of industry, I think Sue and I have done 2 pieces of work where we have showed that even for academic environments, students don't always see the links of what they learn to what they expected to do once they step into an academic position with a PhD. And secondly, we have also argued that we need to be very careful of industry involvement, because that can sort of predicate on what gets researched, which could be immediate needs rather than looking to the future, which is what a PhD actually should be doing. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Liesl. Alan, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Ahmed and the chairperson. Yeah, a lot has been said about the emergence of accidental academics in our country. The thing is, I'm asking myself, since I'm seated here next to the sea, what has contributed maybe to the interest on the part of the other racial groups in terms of pursuing PhD? I'm talking here about the Indians and whites. What could be the motive behind in terms of pursuing a PhD study?
Okay, that's a difficult question to answer. I suspect if you take, well, let me step back. If you take the students who come from the rest of Africa, they're not first generation in their families who are coming to study postgraduate programs. So they've come from societies in which, if you want, the middle class is well established. Their families have gone into professional careers and so forth, and they're no longer dependent, which would be similar, if you want, for Indian and white students. You have family backgrounds in which parents are professionals, they're able to provide support, they're able to raise issues in the home and in the schooling environment, etc. So I suspect as the society develops, and if you take, and I'm using the rest of Africa because the students who come from there are not first generation in their family, by and large. And they're coming to pursue academic careers and want to undertake academic careers. So I think a lot has to do with the social structure, the social and economic structure of the society. And, you know, if I take myself as an example, in an Indian community, when I grew up, you either became a doctor or a lawyer. My grandfather could never understand what I was doing as studying sociology, because the only thing he understood was you became a doctor because you could earn, or a lawyer, and you could earn a large income and so forth. But as my generation has grown up, increasingly our kids can do all sorts of things because we're not tied to a narrow view, which is the nature of development of communities in general. So I suspect a lot of it has to do with where students are coming from and their backgrounds, particularly for first generation students. And it will change as they go into the academic world, as you go into the academic world, as your kids go to school, etc. They will have a different worldview about what's possible than what was there before.
Oh. Okay.
Alan, did you want to
There's a follow-up. No. It was loud and clear, Stephen. Okay, thank you.
Good. Thank you. Colleagues, any other comments or questions that anybody would like to make? No, if not, I must say, Ahmed, for me, it's always very fascinating to me to look at all those statistics and to look at the story that you tell and the messages that we receive. And I would like to say that although it's some of it is kind of puzzling, and we wonder to ourselves, as you have today, about why we are worrying about some of these questions, in particular the full-time, part-time question, and the issue of how we expect our students to graduate in particular times. I would quite like to hear your views on how we might improve the supervisions. And I don't mean just making sure that all of our supervisors are trained in some way, but in terms of things like panel and cohort supervision, whether you think that would make a difference to, I think it would make a difference to the quality of the students, but the way, the rate at which they graduate, the success of what they do. Would we just be making life more complicated for ourselves? Or do you think that we should really be exploring those different models?
Well, look, I've not got a PhD, so I can't comment on from experience. But my sense is, firstly, what the student talked of horror stories. I mean, I know a friend's daughter who's very bright and who's doing a PhD, has been doing a PhD at a very reputable institution for the last 9 years. Okay. For the last 9 years, has had very little feedback in that time from her supervisor. The supervisor unfortunately passed away recently. So both, I think what the students were saying is that the current model that we have is lonely. It's a one-on-one, all on your own. And I see that even with my colleagues at the center, we really come together. We had a writing retreat at the moment. Everybody's sitting in their rooms writing. We're not discussing and engaging with whatever they're writing about. Okay, and so a lot of them were saying the one-on-one model in that sense is lonely. There's no peer community. That the postgraduate centers, but often that focuses on technical skills, writing skills, etc. That if you come together in a group from different, you don't all be having to do the same topics, etc., but you learn from each other. And if you take the humanities, there are different theoretical or methodological approaches that different people have. By engaging in critique and engaging with each other, that helps. I've attended seminars. So this is anecdotal. Wits University has a graduate school of the humanities, which in a sense brings all their humanities doctoral students as a group. I often don't understand what they're saying because it's a higher theory that even I can't process in my mind. But you can see they're engaging, they're working together, they're engaging and critiquing each other's work and so forth. So I think there's a and given the nature, and Wits started that program because they recognized that the nature of schooling and higher education and the context we were operating in required something different. So I don't think, as Sue and company have argued, that it needs to be done everywhere. It may be being done in the sciences at any rate, easier to do in the sciences. But it's something we need to engage with. I think the resources required may not be available. It requires staff to be committed to working together, reading everybody's work and so forth. I use the example at Wits, they have a cohort model for psychology. And it's very intensive from the information that I have. And it doesn't necessarily address the power relationship because it's a different form of power relationship. There's a power relationship between the students who participate amongst themselves. There's a power relation between the academics who participate in the program. But it does require a level of commitment and work, given all the other pressures that people have that make it quite difficult. But I suspect it may be one way of addressing some of the challenges that we have with the one-on-one model. But I think Sue may be better placed because she's done work in this area to talk about that. Just one quick thing. I noticed in the chat somebody, I'm not a professor. I'm a plain and simple mister. Okay, I don't want to be accused of of claiming a title that I don't have.
Thank you. So there are, incidentally, before I say any more, Fundiswa, you had your hand up and I saw you took it down. Do you want to make a comment?
Yes, Prof. I wanted to just to contribute on that question of how does the doctoral kind of position itself to the society around it. So I was thinking of starting from the ground level of schooling, because you can see on the career days, the university go in and promote their universities and career kind of way. But the emphasis every time is about them getting the entry to the university, not going beyond what you can do in terms of your studies and like that trend of saying now you do your undergrad and then there is opportunity for postgrad. And the student, for me, they really are getting a very narrow and shallow kind of career kind of pathway to the university. And they always see like that, is that when I do my undergrad, complete it and go and get some work. This is what is being sold to them. That's the one point. Number two, about the supervision, I'm sure that you, as a CHA, I think we did our little bit part of, put it in the standard, how we view the supervision and what is the kind of expectation, what are the other, options that are available for the universities to go through, so that they could just, have the option of supervision. So I think for me, that is a start. But again, when I saw the improvement plan, when they were coming in, the institution were pushed to think beyond what they have. I mean, for example, they have different models now compared to what they have before. So yeah, with the policies, of course, they amended with their policies. Thank you.
Can I just make
Thank
one
you.
general
Yes,
comment,
yes.
particularly related to the earlier point about whether all academics need a doctorate and the experience that a doctorate brings. I don't know about universities in general, but my experience, having done some work at UJ on workloads, until a few years ago, UJ didn't have a workload policy. And I sort of did a pilot study of 2 faculties. And what really struck me is a lot of senior academics, with the experience, were not doing any undergraduate teaching. Even at postgraduate level, they were buying out time for marking and so forth, because what they were doing and what the university expects is to do research outputs like a machine, produce more and more. So I think senior professors should be teaching at the first year. If they've got the experience to excite students and so forth. In fact, a lot of the junior academics who were being given all the teaching were commenting on how they were looked down upon by the students because they just graduated. They had no experience. They may have been tech savvy and so forth. And so we do a disservice to our students. So to give you a personal example, my son studied at UCT 10, 15 years ago, and he did English and politics. And in his first year, I'd asked him, very reluctantly, he showed me his essays because I said, I may be able to help you improve your work. It was interesting. In the politics department, his tutor was a master's student, okay? Although the topic he was writing on, I had no understanding of, I was able to give him comments that would help him improve his essay than the master's student was able to do. In English, his essays were being marked by a senior academic, and the comments reflected that. Okay, so in a sense, in politics, the blind were leading the blind. He wasn't going to improve his work, and that's no fault of the master's students who was tutoring him, because he or she didn't have the experience either. Whereas in English, he was being tutored by a senior academic who was also his lecturer, and the comments were reflective of that. Now I understand we have large groups and it's not possible for all the academics, but academics don't, at least at UJ in the work that I was doing at the time, they weren't lecturing, forget tutoring. Okay, at undergraduate, it was all being left to junior academics, and even at senior levels, they were buying out time, etc. And so what we have is a perverse incentive in our institutions because of the research funding, playing the ranking game, and so on. And all of that needs to change.
Mm. Mm. Yes, I have to say, and I'm going to stop talking in a moment, but I have to say I couldn't agree more with that idea that you should have your best, most exciting professors lecturing the first years. That was an experience I had as a first-year student many, many years ago, and it's why I became a biochemist. So I really do hear you, and I think that that's something that we should perhaps be saying a little more about as we talk about how to prepare our students for the ideas around higher degrees. I think we've probably had as many comments as we're going to have. I would like to say, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I confess I did think when we started that I knew what that report was all about, because as you said, I did respond to it some years ago. But this has been a very fascinating presentation, and I'm sure everybody agrees that it's been extremely worthwhile. And I do want to say thank you very much for your taking the time to explain it all, to talk about it, and for us to have an opportunity to discuss it. So Ahmed, thank you so much for your presentation and for the discussion. And let me just hand over to Sue to just say a final
I just
word.
make one point? I see Sue's talking
Yeah.
about liberalism. It's a big, all the postdocs, whenever I read, everything is linked to neoliberalism. All my colleagues complain about what Sue is writing there, about how much they have to constantly publish or perish. And I keep saying to them, why don't you organize yourselves? So there's no, in the UK, they go on strike for salaries. And the response I get from my colleagues is, well, if we organize and take up these issues, it will impact on our promotion possibilities within the institution, etc. So academics are not using the agency to question some of what is well, not some, of what is going on in our institutions, whether it's in terms of the sort of research treadmill, the fact that postdocs, they do research on anything and everything because they have to produce. So whatever the latest fad is, you get a paper, because it can be published somewhere. So I think there's some broader issues that the academy needs to think about as the academic community, rather than management and the sort of broader policy at government level. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you,
Yeah.
Sue.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that last comment as well. I do think it's time for solidarity and for big strategic thinking around these issues. The truth is that those of us who complain about the neoliberal subjects all the time very happily play that game and get all the things that come with playing that game. And so I think we need to have a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror. Hopefully, we've all got something from this session. I know I certainly have. Everyone who's registered for the session will receive a link to the recording as soon as the ever-efficient Shiloh has loaded it onto the website. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and thanks, Ahmed, for your input.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.